It's often pointed out that Christianity is always only one generation away from extinction, and therefore the most important mission field for any church is their own children. We exist to nurture the newest ones alive. Why? It seems odd in one way because in antiquity, Aristotle, along with other thinkers, did not believe that children were fully human. But there was this figure named Jesus of Nazareth who was like Mr. Rogers in robe and sandals. He not only played with children, he told adults that they had to become like children. He flipped from what we usually do. We say, now, young person, you grow up and act like an adult. Jesus did the opposite. He said, adults, you better become like a child if you want to be a part of my kingdom. And so parents, your child is a little role model of what God wants you to trust him, even as your child trusts you. Now, it also says in Jesus' words that anyone who betrays the trust of a child, God help that person. I must say to you that I am a battle-scarred pastor from having been with parents as they were going through the problems of having sex abuse of their children. I have on numerous occasions, sadly to say, sat with parents in a waiting room while in the next room there was a female police officer who was taking them through with a little correct doll to find out what had happened. I've been with the parents when the parents received the worst news that they could ever imagine, and there's nothing like that pain. I also have to say to you that part of the healing of a child after that trauma is that child needs to see the world come down with both feet on top of those responsible, and especially on the perpetrator. And Jesus even goes so far as to say that, I tell you, anyone who causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better for him to have a millstone tied about his neck and he be cast into the depths of the sea. That is a metaphor. It's a metaphor, but it speaks of God's protection of children. In fact, I'd like for us to go back to the dawn of the Bible where children take center stage. It's back to the time when the children of Israel have just become a people. They have experienced a string of miraculous events like the world had never seen. They had escaped from Egypt in the world's most storied chase scene, crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. They had been fed from bread from heaven. They had received God's law with thunder and lightning from the top of Mount Sinai. They were guided by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And finally, at last, generations later, or decades later, they arrive at the very brink of the promised land. The problem is what's happened is the generation who experienced firsthand all of those wonderful, spectacular miracles is dying off. They're getting old and they're passing away. And the kids don't know that. They did not experience that. And Moses senses that everything hinges on keeping fresh and alive this picture of who God is. And so Moses out there amidst the sand and the gullies and the rattlesnakes has everybody sit down for a parenting seminar. And Moses looks them in the eye and he says words to these parents that I believe are relevant to us as parents today. As Moses addresses the children of Israel before they cross over into the land flowing with milk and honey, he has urgent words to them, and he tells parents, it all depends on you. We're going to start with the first verse of Deuteronomy chapter 6. We read, "These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you, to observe in the land that you're crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, and bind them to your foreheads. Sometimes you may have seen an Orthodox Jew with wearing what they call phylacteries, which is a strap around their foreheads, and you see these symbols of the law that extend in front of their eyes from their forehead, literally following what it says here, that you're to bind the law on your foreheads. And then it goes on to say, write them on your doorposts, your door frames, and of your houses, and on your gates. Here ends the reading. Don't these words sound strange to us in child rearing today? We hear decrees, laws, commandments, teach your children to obey, even to fear the Lord, and all of this you are to impress upon them top down. There's not a word here about self-esteem, about loving yourself, about explaining logical consequences, or acing the SAT. But what I want to say to you is, in a surprising way, the breaking news in child rearing today, we're finding very often the latest things that I'm discovering very much lines up and agrees with Moses and his instructions about child rearing. Because there is a growing consensus today that what we are doing as we raise our children is not working. For example, the notion that if you raise a child with high self-esteem, they will grow up healthy and happy is now being called into great question. Therapists are seeing more and more teenagers and young adults who have very high self-esteem, along with depression and anxiety and a feeling of being unprepared for life. The insights I'm going to be sharing with you in large part come from two experts, Lori Gottlieb, who's writing in the Atlantic Monthly, and also David Brooks, who many of you know I have a great regard for, in his classic book, The Social Animal. And what they say is that while in 1920, the advice was don't hug your kid too much, today the pendulum has swung the other way to the point where it's my child must be happy in every way at all times, so that anything that goes wrong becomes an instant SOS to the parents. And as Lori Gottlieb says, we have too much discomfort with discomfort in our children, so that today college administrators refer to the incoming freshmen as, quote, teacups. They are so fragile that if anything goes wrong, they will probably break apart or feel like they will. And then Lori Gottlieb says that subconsciously, many of us parents really don't want our children to leave home, and because they leave behind this huge hole in our emotional life. Did you know that at the University of Chicago now, on freshman weekend, they now have a special bagpipe recessional to march parents back out to their cars? Yeah. And at the University of Vermont, they've gone to hiring parent bouncers just to get rid of parents who refuse to leave. You know, could it be that we're confusing our needs with our children's needs and calling that good parenthood? A generation ago, my parents, they simply wanted to be appreciated. They didn't feel like they needed to be my best pals. And Moses clearly here is being old school, like my parents' generation, because what he is saying here, he says, impress upon them these commandments and these decrees and these laws, and teach them to obey. What he's really saying here is, what's best for your kids is that there be times when they cannot stand us. To me, most surprising is this rethinking of self-esteem. A growing number of young adults who have a very high opinion of themselves nonetheless lack the emotional resiliency to be able to take on life it is. And as one author says, if a child grows up hearing great job every time they put on their shoes, that's not really preparing them for life at 21. And if we pamper them too much, they become, quote, a handicapped royalty. There's a rethinking of this no winner, no loser, everybody gets a trophy way of running sports programs. And the logic of that is very interesting. And what it says is, why would you want to create an unrealistic bubble when a child steps out of it? They are totally unprepared for how life really works in the real world. It's kind of like the saying we sometimes hear, don't prepare the road for your child, prepare your child for the road. There's another piece of advice in this tell it like it is way of parenting today. And this I find fascinating, and that is it says, do not say to your child, you are smart. I used to say it all the time to my daughters. I'd say, you are so smart. But here, they say, don't do that. What you should do is compliment your child for working hard. And it doesn't sound like a big deal, but here's the logic. It says, if you compliment your child for working hard, then they are going to feel like they want to take on challenges, and they're going to eat challenges for breakfast, and they're going to see mistakes as just something that just happens on the way to facing a challenge and working hard. But if you call them smart, smart is a kind of status that you try to protect by never looking unsmart, and therefore children will tend to take easy classes and avoid taking on challenges. And then there's this other smack in the chops for us parents as well. And I find this really interesting, and perhaps you will as well. And that is, when it comes to choices, too many choices are bad for a child. Fewer choices, the better. And here's the study that they did as along to coming to that conclusion. They did an art study in which one group of children were given an assortment of 3 color pens, and then they gave another group of children an assortment of 24 color pens. And then each of them were to draw their masterpiece, and they drew their masterpiece, and then they randomized all of those pictures that had been drawn by these children, and they gave that stack of pictures to a panel of experts and had them rate those paintings on their quality. It was not even close. And what it turned out is those that had only 3 colors, markers, were far, far better than those who had 24 markers. And why? Because they said, because children feel safer and less anxious with fewer choices. In a sense, that's what Moses is saying right here in this book. He is saying, narrow the choices, narrow the field. Maybe narrow it down to 1. The Lord your God is one. In our family, we live God's way. And that sounds so confining. And it may even sound, I hate to say, intolerant. There is one way that these children are to be raised. But it also echoes the wisdom of Jesus, doesn't it? Where Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13, he says this, enter by the narrow gate. For the way is wide, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many travel it. One of the most helpful things I've run across in my ministry is someone once diagrammed the narrow gate and the wide gate in terms of 2 triangles. The first triangle is like a teepee with no bottom, with an open bottom. And this open bottom down here in this teepee shape, that's the wide gate. It's our culture. It's what the world is saying to us. Turn on a television commercial. It's saying, hey, whatever works for you right now. Do whatever you want. It's a mile wide, inch deep culture, and just kind of live the vida loca and just do what you want. And you enter in with all the sense of freedom into the wide gate. But then what happens? What? As you go further into that life, well, life starts getting narrow, as represented by those slanting sides of the triangle. And you go further and you find less and less freedom, less and less of what you were actually looking for. And finally, at the end, you smack into a dead end. But then on the other hand, you can look at the narrow gate in the form of a V, a triangle that ends in a V. And that point of the V is the narrow gate. And it looks so unfun. It looks so confining. It's about commandments and decrees and laws and obeying and even fearing the Lord, as it says in our text, and walking the narrow path. And you walk through that narrow gate. And you know what? Something surprising happens. Life opens up. And you experience confidence. And you experience your belovedness as a child of God. You sense a call on your life that gives you meaning and purpose, and you end up living an inner-directed life as a person of faith by entering the narrow gate. My parents were big supporters of that narrow gate. They had a very, very brief mission statement as they were raising us children. And their mission statement was God and grades. That was it. It's about God and grades. And nothing else really mattered. We were, all of us, athletes, but my parents didn't give a rip how well we did on the athletic field. I actually had a brother who was a small college All-American linebacker, and my parents just went, whoopee-doo, tell me your grades. How is your walk with the Lord? And that was the narrowness of the path that we were taught to walk. And then there's another word that from these latest studies that I just find, I love this. This is just grace, in my view anyway, and you'll see why I love it so much. And that is, it says, the studies show that IQ is no big deal. You see why I love it. IQ is no big deal. And what they say, what these studies show is there is a certain IQ that is not far above average, that is all you need to become a world leader or a rocket scientist or a Nobel laureate. And a sky-high, dazzling IQ is probably worth about 4% of a boost. But really, all you need is this baseline is all you need in order to be everything that everybody defines as successful. And what the example David Brooks shows is such a good one. He says it's like being a soldier. We want soldiers to be strong, don't we? A strong soldier is a really good thing to have. But then he said, if you have a 400-pound bench press soldier, you go, well, you come to think of it, the greatest soldiers who ever lived couldn't bench press 400 pounds. George Washington couldn't bench 400 pounds. General MacArthur, General Patton, General Eisenhower, they couldn't bench 400 pounds. They were just strong. They had enough strength to be a soldier. And that's what they had, that baseline. And what really made them great generals was really a whole range of other factors. And then David Brooks says, in the end, it's issues of character, like discipline, work habits, judgment, responsibility, and faithfulness and honesty. And that in the end, character is what wins. And then Moses says to impress these things on our children. He says, talk about them in your home, when you sit in your home, when you walk along the way, when you rise up, and when you lie down. In other words, what I hear him saying here is we need to have family rituals. Do you ever in your family have a saying where you say, in our family, we do thus and so? For example, in our family, we say, in our family, the Pence family, we always say grace before we eat under this roof. In our family, we have certain issues of justice that really matter to us and giving to God's work, and we give to God's work in our family. We have this thing that we said to our daughters since they were really little. We said, in our family, you can always come home. No matter what happens to you in life, life can beat you up. You can make terrible mistakes. There is no mistake you can make that you cannot come home. You can always come home. And our daughters have had that in their minds from the time they were little girls. You can always come home. We also had another one, and that is we Pences stick together. I will tell you, we Pences are really like the Corleone family, okay? If you mess with one Pence, you mess with all the Pences. And I just thought you might like to know, okay? We talk of these things. We sit in our home and we drive in our car and so tell the stories of Jesus to your kids. Sing those songs and open those picture books and tell of God's love. And believe it or not, there's one other piece of advice that's the best advice at all that I haven't even mentioned yet. But Moses mentions it in verse 5, and that's before he even gets to this stuff about kids. Here's what he says. This is the critical thing on which it all hinges. He says to parents, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And then he says, these commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. It's kind of like one of the things that every family seems to love to do, and that is, don't families love to walk on the beach? And when a set of parents are walking on the beach, very often you'll notice that if they have little children, the little children will sort of fall behind them while the parents are engaged in the conversation. Little kids will fall behind them. And then the parents will turn around and they'll look. And what's the little child doing? The child behind is trying to step in the footsteps of the parents as the parents are walking along. In other words, unconsciously, the parents are creating impressions that child is going to follow. And boy, you can see what I'm leading to. And that is, it's the things that you do unconsciously every single day that are creating the path and the impressions that your child is going to follow. And let me give you some really good news about that. One of the studies that I love this one, and this one says they did a study of young adults in their 20s and 30s who have stayed active in their faith. And they said, what is the single greatest predictor that a young person who grows up in the church will one day continue in their faith and walk with God? And there is one great predictor, one. It as far surpasses any other one. You know what it is? Is that person, when they were in childhood, their dad went to worship and sat in church. And so dads, without even noticing it, unconsciously, you are having a massive impression by the fact that you are simply here. And your presence here is creating that path that will not leave your child. The impact of your being in church as a father. I love what a friend of mine says. It's just not true that the best way to lead is by example. That he said, the only way to lead is by example. Well, there's this little story in the Gospels where there's a man named Jairus. He's a father, desperate dad. His daughter is hovering near death. And Jairus runs. He's a religious leader. He runs to Jesus, throws himself on the ground, and he begs Jesus, please come heal my daughter. She's near death. And Jesus says, do not be afraid, only believe. In other words, what Jesus says is, trust me, have patience. And then Jesus goes and gets sidetracked with this woman who has a severe hemorrhage, and he heals her and talks to her and talks to the crowd. And by the time that Jesus actually arrives at Jairus' house, the mourners are already there and the little girl is dead. And people are sobbing, and Jesus simply says, why all the commotion? She's only sleeping. And Jesus walks into this room where this little girl is lying there, kicks everybody out, and Jesus sits right next to this little girl, and he takes her hand, and he says two words. He says the first word is Talitha, which means little girl. But it's more than that. Talitha in Hebrew in Aramaic is it's a pet name. It's a kind of a word of endearing. It's the word that we would use here in the South, talking to a little girl. It's the word honey. Talitha. And then the next word he says is kum, which means get up, rise. It doesn't mean get resurrected. It just means arise. And so what Jesus says to this little girl who's died, as he holds her hand, he says, honey, it's time to get up. Jesus goes toe-to-toe with the worst enemy that our children will ever face. And he just takes this little girl right up through all of that enemy, all of that horror, and just lifts her right up and says, honey, it's time to get up. And what it's saying is, if you have Jesus holding your hand, my goodness, there's nothing in life you need to fear, not even death. You know, when we were children, we were holding our parents' hands, and we thought, well, nothing can go wrong if we're holding our parents' hands. But of course, we were wrong. I mean, there were bad parents. There were parents like us who do our very best, but we make mistakes. We do things that we wish we hadn't done. But there's somebody in whose hand we can put our child's hand who will never fail them. They will always be there even when we're not there. Someone who walks with them every day through this life and even into eternity. And so I want to say to you, impress these things upon your child. When you sit in your home, when you walk by the road, when you rise up and when you lie down. And if you do that, you will have done your job as a parent. There's really nothing more you really have to do before God. If you do that, there's nothing left to do. And the rest is up to them.